I went to that place called Armageddon, where I did this. And then this. Because they had a tank I could talk about in this video, which has been sponsored by Audible, but more of that later.
Here's a strange beast. When I was a little Kidlington, I used to think this was called the Lee Grant, because the Airfix kit said Lee/Grant on the front of the box, and I and my brother, when we were wargaming, always ended up calling these Lee Grants.
Wait a minute, stop! That's not Armageddon. That's Bovington Tank Museum, or the Tank Museum, as I wish it now didn't call itself. No, the vehicle they have at Armageddon was in a rather different state of repair, but a rather good one if you want to be able to see inside.
And here we have the hull of a Lee, or I suppose you could say the hull of a Grant, because they were almost exactly the same. But this one was, strictly speaking, a Lee, and it is the only Lee in Britain. And it's here at the Armageddon workshops. And it's being, as you can see, lovingly restored. This red is the common colour of the primer, the rust protection undercoat that's used on a lot of tanks. You can see that this is based on a Sherman because it has the same suspension as the very early Shermans. There was a return roller on the top here, which is characteristic of the early Shermans. And one nice little design feature of the Sherman suspension, wheel system if you like, is that the sprockets, you see, are on a separate plate. You see, you can take them off with these bolts here, remove this bit when it gets worn out, chuck that away, and then bolt on a new one and you're good to go. So that made it quick to maintain in that department at least. Another thing which helped is that you've got all these bolts here. Now a lot of people say that a tank shouldn't have bolts on the front. German tanks don't have that. They're nice and smooth. It's just armour. The front of a Panther is just weld and armour, and it's great. Well, yeah, but if you want to repair a Panther, and you have to, for instance, work on the front differential, which you actually have to quite often if you're a Panther and you've worn out your gearbox or you've damaged something, it's taken a shock. How do you get to it? Well, I'll tell you. You get it into a workshop, you take the turret off, you take everything apart, and it has to go that way and up and out. It was an enormous job. But with one of these, take off the bolts, and then you've taken the front bit off the tank, and there's the stuff that you have to get to. Ding-a-ding-a-ding with your spanners and wrenches and what have you. Okay, I exaggerate. I imagine it was a little bit more complicated than that, but the point is you could get to what you needed to get to quickly, stick it back on, and you were good to go. And you didn't necessarily need massive cranes and all the rest of it. So a much smaller workshop could handle the job of keeping this sort of thing maintained. Here we have two welded up holes that once had the barrels sticking out of them of machine guns. The Americans at the start of World War II had this idea that it's just great to festoon everything with more machine guns. You can never have too many machine guns because it just goes bada, 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 and it looks really good in the films when you're trying to promote "buy our tank, army people, go on, buy our tank, it looks great, look, it's covered in machine guns," and they go bang. But the British decided that actually they're a bit rubbish, and they removed them and just put armour over the top, because a fixed machine gun almost never hit anything. You couldn't aim it accurately. They're very noisy, and they take up room. They create heat and smoke, and you've got to store lots of ammo for them. And so really, what is the point? In the Lee, there was, in an American version, there was a crewman sitting behind this who worked those machine guns, who was also the radio operator. But the British dispensed with that. They had their radios in the turrets, and the loader in the turret would be also the radio operator, typically. And so that saved a whole man. And you don't want too many eggs in one basket. If one of these goes up in smoke, you could lose the entire crew. So the fewer men that are in there, the fewer you're risking in battle. This box, I've just been told, was used for storing the grousers, the things that you attach to the sides of the tracks to make everything a little bit wider, so you've got better ground pressure, lower ground pressure if you like. So if you're in the desert and you're going over soft sand, it's good to have wider tracks. And if you are going to store large lumps of metal, well, you may as well stick them on the front so they act as extra armour. This big hatch here is the driver's vision port, and this thing is, well, you could say it's the main gun, but others might argue that the main gun was on the turret. But this is the big gun. This was the 75mm. It's sometimes referred to as a howitzer, but I'm not sure if that's strictly true, because it was mainly a direct fire weapon. It was designed to shoot at things that you could actually see. It had two crewmen who had to be behind this. It got a bit of a naval gun look about it. Also, it may remind you of a World War I tank. Same sort of thing. Think of the side sponsons on a British World War I mail tank. Well, it's this sort of arrangement, and it was actually a rather outdated arrangement. If you wanted to shoot at the enemy with this tank, you had to come right onto the top of a hill so that you exposed almost all your tank to take him on, whereas if you got a tank which has its main gun in the turret, then perhaps you just expose the turret. You just creep up the hill, expose the turret, shoot, and then you're a much harder target to return fire against. So this made this tank design a little vulnerable to the enemy guns, which unfortunately in the desert in North Africa, the Germans had pretty good guns. And whilst this was an adequate piece of kit, in the long term, it was considered an obsolete design, and the British and Americans both concluded that it was much better to go over something with just one turret, forget about the big gun in the hull thing, stick a decent gun in the turret. It's ergonomically better, you need fewer crew, and you're a less vulnerable target, and they developed multi-purpose guns that could fire both high explosive and armor piercing effectively, whereas this is only really a high explosive gun. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge of a design. They put these together pretty quickly. They needed a tank, they needed it now, and they were working on the Sherman at the time, but they needed something to get out there and fight the enemy, and this is what they came up with. And considering that they had to put something in the field quickly, it's not that bad. And here in Armageddon's vehicle repair workshop, we see masses of stuff to be cleaned up, to be identified, to be repaired, and to be stuck back into the Lee. One day, perhaps it'll be a runner, and won't that be exciting? Now, at the moment, they don't have a turret on it, but in a few weeks, they're hoping to get a turret to stick up there. In the meantime, I see that I have a radial engine to tell you about. Now, this is the Continental R975. It's the first of the two kinds. There was the C1 and the C4. This one developed 400 horsepower, which is, well, enough to move a tank. It's a radial engine, which was a configuration designed for aircraft. Yes, this was for taking an aircraft and hurling it up into the sky, but instead they used them for tanks. They worked perfectly well. The Shermans used radial engines as well. There are some drawbacks, one being that they're quite tall, and so the Americans produced some rather tall tanks, and tall tanks make more conspicuous targets. But it was powerful enough, it was smooth as well. A lot of British tankers who were in British tanks and in Shermans said that there was a smoothness to the radial engine tanks. They would set off without quite so much of a jolt, which they rather liked. Another thing is that it's air-cooled, and one of the drawbacks of the air-cooled is that it has to draw in air from somewhere, and one place to draw in air is through the top hatches of the tank. So when the engine's running and you're driving along in your tank, it's drawing air down through the turret hatches. So if you're sitting in that turret hatch and you're in a column of tanks and they're throwing up dust, that dust is being sucked down onto you. And if it's raining, you don't just get the rain that would have fallen on you anyway. Oh no, you get a bit more rain that's sucked into you, so you get even wetter. But what the hell, radial engines, they worked. Right, so here I am in the engine compartment. Obviously when this was in use, you wouldn't be standing here because this would be full of engine. Noise, 4 fuel tanks in the back here. All right, and then through here, you wouldn't have to do this very often. I certainly couldn't do it at speed. This is where the fighting compartment was. And to the right here, the 75mm gun. This here is the housing for the gearbox, and in front of that, in that box there, is the differential. And between where my legs are now, there would have been a big prop shaft that went through this slot here, and through that little hoop there, and into the back engine compartment. So that will be transferring power from the engine to the gearbox. So you've got a whirling piece of steel here, which is not insignificant, given that this is where the driver was. You can actually see some of his controls here and here. So this got pretty hot and uncomfortable. Don't forget that this was used in desert warfare. So here you are in a steel box in the desert, sitting astride a great big bit of whirring steel. Yep, you certainly would be warm enough. So stay hydrated, everyone. Do drink plenty of water. Now, while I'm here, may I point out the construction method here. So we have these rivets, and these rivets go through a sheet of metal here, which is holding this slab of armour to this slab of armour. Now, the Germans at this stage were welding their tanks together, and so the slabs of armour were the box, if you like, whereas the British and Americans were still using this creating a frame approach and then rivet onto that frame your slabs of armour. This is not the strongest way to make a tank, but it's quick. Here, just been sprayed, a couple of the bits that the driver would use. So remember, he's sitting astride the gearbox, and so the gearbox would be here, and so these would be along his centre line, and he'd have his feet on the outside on the pedals there. So there's another one which goes there. So these will be stuck back in the tank, and this is the 37mm gun, which when they've got a turret to stick it in, they'll stick it in. And you can see that, ignore the shield, by the way, this is just a temporary thing put on for a show. You can see that it's really not terribly big. This is the size of the cartridge to the shell that they were firing out of it. It's just 37mm. The standard German anti-tank gun at the start of World War II was the same caliber, and they sometimes refer to them as door knockers because you could shoot again and again at something like a Matilda and it would just ping off rather embarrassingly and frustratingly. So these were not stupendously powerful, and they were deemed quite quickly to be obsolete. On most tanks they were replaced, but on some armoured cars and light vehicles, they were still using these right the way to the end of the war. And they're still useful. I mean, they will go through an armoured car or a half-track or anything like that. If you've got some lightly armoured vehicle, this is absolutely adequate. And don't forget, the smaller the shell, the more you can carry, and the quicker they are to maneuver, and so the faster you can shoot. So if there is some light armoured thing, like an armoured car buzzing around the battlefield, you're far more likely to hit it with one of these because you can get off loads and loads of shots against it. And if you do, this is adequate. But if you come across something big, if you came across a Panther or something, then you'd be incredibly lucky to harm it much with this. It's not impossible, and there are tales of guns like this knocking out tigers, but it's really rare. You can see that the breech at the back here is pretty small, and so that will go in and like that. And this is the actual shell that came out of it. Yes, this gun, which was in Australia and was brought back from there, when they opened the breech, they found this in it. So it seems, okay, it was not actually live. It didn't have any propellant in it, so it was reasonably safe, but it does suggest that no one had checked. As you can see, the turret is missing, but it would be here, and that would have 3 men in it. It's a tiny turret to have 3 men in it, but there was a commander and a gunner and loader for the tiny gun up there. Down here you had 2 men working the main gun, and there was a time when there were a total of 7 in here. You had a radio operator who would be sitting over there, and the driver, of course, whose position was there. The turret basket for the lee, and you can see the shell brackets there, and they look so tiny. Having been looking earlier today at 100mm caliber, they look like tiny, almost comically small shells. In fact, the whole thing looks quite small. If Alex were to stand next to it to give you a bit of scale, there you go. There's a person next to the turret basket. So it was a pretty small turret.
Oh, but I promised to tell you all about Audible, and I so hate to disappoint. Audible is a giant website, you see, this is what it looks like, selling all manner of audio material. And if you go to the address appearing now on your screen, or click the link in the description, which is easier, you can do what I'm about to do for free with their introductory offer. You just have to type in the magic word, Ta'anaka. Here we go then, Ta'anaka. And see what we get. Right, top hit there, tank action. Oh, that sounds good. Action, Fury of the Tiger. Sounds a bit over the top. Could be a novel. Tank, that looks fairly novelly. What? Hang on, what was that? Isolation tank. Oh, no, forget that. That's not a proper tank. No action ever happens in an isolation tank. What was that about fish? Oh, fish tank. Yes, I get it. No. Now, I'm talking about proper tanks, with turrets and bang and action. Okay, let's have a look at this first one then. Okay, so there it is. Some suggested other things that are similar. You can listen to a sample. That's always good.
The scattered houses of Fontenay had been badly knocked about by our own artillery.
Okay. French houses being blown up by the British. So that sounds all right. Oh, but is it excellent all the way through, though? I mean, maybe they just picked the best bit. Lots of 5-star reviews there, and by a fair decent number of people as well. You see, you got 97 there, and 86 and 88. And no one's given it less than 3. All right, one person has given it fewer than 3 stars. But perhaps that person didn't like tanks. Some people don't, In addition to one audiobook per month, you get 2 Audible originals. These can be anything audio, podcasts, stand-up comedy, those sorts of thing. And this is not a streaming service. You download the files and keep them. They are yours, your property. Ah, the inevitable Stephen Fry there. Oh, David Mitchell, I like him. And, well, lots more. In fact, to listen to everything on the site would take over 3 centuries, so you're really spoiled for choice. So, to listen to your chosen stuff whenever you want, www.audible.com/Lindybeige or text Lindybeige to 500 500, works best if you're in the USA, and find out about the free trial period offer. Phew! Now, back to the Lee.
Now, one feature that you may notice is the way these rivets have all been very thoroughly welded in place. You can see a circle of welding around every single one. And I've just been told that the reason for this is that it was possible for an enemy bit of incoming fire to hit the end of a rivet, causing the entire rivet to ping off and shoot into the tank, injuring one of the crew, and possibly ricocheting around and injuring more than one of the crew. And so to stop that happening, they've all been welded firmly into place, which I'm sure was tremendously reassuring for all the crew. Here we see 2 contrasting designs of wheel. This is the later style and this the earlier. Now, the main difference is that I can put my hand all the way through this one, you see, and of course holds are good because they save weight, whereas this one is solid. You've got some spoke-like constructions in the raised bits here, but you can't put your hand through there because, well, it's solid. Now, some of the early versions, like this, were converted to be more like that, and they actually welded over little bits of metal so that people couldn't put their hands through. Why were they worried about people putting their hands through, I imagine? You may be thinking, well, it's because the Japanese found that if they put a big steel bar through there, then when the wheel turned and it came to hit the spring here, or the bogie arm, it could really foul up your suspension and break something, perhaps snapping one of the wheels. And so that was the cause of this change in design. And when the British replaced that 7th crewman, who, if you remember, was operating those useless hull machine guns, they put in place these. These are water containers, hence the big W. The rubber seals here have perished, but this is the original thing. And yes, it was full of water, drinking water. You're in the desert, you're going to need lots of these. Far, far more useful than a couple of stupid machine guns that never hit anything. Now, there are lots of bits that they've taken out of the Lee to restore, and this will be cleaned up and restored and put back in, and that'll be great. But what is it? Well, it's part of the gyroscopic gun stabilization mechanism. There are a couple of flywheels here. There's one that goes round and round in that plane. So that would gyroscopically stabilize this thing, which would stay level as the tank that the rest of it would be fixed to, I think, moved around. And there's another one which rotates in the other plane there, which has a very good electrical contact, a brush there. So there are lots of electrical wires, so clearly there's a fair bit of electrical circuitry involved in this. I was surprised that it had flywheels in both planes. So far as I know, the gun was only actually stabilized in the up and down direction, because you'd have to move the entire turret left and right, which is asking rather a lot of a system like this. But anyway, it has 2 flywheels, and these would sense the movement of the tank, and these would send information to, I think, a hydraulic system which would be much more powerful than these tiny little flywheels, and it would be the hydraulic system that actually controlled provided the force to move the gun up and down. So the idea is you're rumbling across the countryside and you're going up hills and down hills, and you see a target in front of you, and whilst you are still moving, you aim the gun at it, and the gun then stays pointing at the enemy, and so you can fire accurately on the move. There are a number of problems with this, one being that it really didn't work very well. If you want accuracy, you really, with World War II technology, had to stop and aim properly and shoot. And crews didn't rely on these, and it's another thing to go wrong, and another thing that's in the tank that you can bash your head on. And my information is that most of these systems were actually ripped out quite quickly by the crews who didn't trust them and didn't want them.
Return rollers? Return rollers installed in their places.
75mm shell rack. Modern art installation. And this American armoured car is a Greyhound, sporting the same gun, 37mm. And these were used to the end of the war. Now, this was a Lee, that is to say it had a particular kind of turret that was about this tall and had a big sloping front, and the American version had in the commander's position a little machine gun turret with a 30 cal Browning in it. And the British didn't like that turret. They wanted radio in the turret, and they didn't like such a high turret, and they didn't like this silly extra machine gun thing. These Americans with their silly extra machine guns. So instead they just had a proper commander's hatch, a cupola for the commander, a pretty simple hatch.
Here we see a Grant on the left and a Lee on the right, making preparations for El Alamein in 1942. You can see that this chap is clearly poking out of a top hatch, whereas this cove is next to the rather useless top machine gun turret. This one is standing outside the Tank Museum in Latrun in Israel. Note the British markings and no top MG turret. But wait! Do I see a vision port in the side of the one next to it? I do! It's a Grant. The main body of the turret isn't much shorter. That's not a muzzle brake on the hull gun, that's a counterweight to balance with the breech on the earlier, slightly shorter barrelled version. 1,386 Lees were sent out from the USA bound for the Soviet Union. Thanks to German U-boats and their ilk, though, only 969 Lees arrived. When I first saw this picture, I thought, oh dear, this French tank museum has made a right pig's ear of restoring this Grant. That turret looks like a primitive mock-up, and that mantlet is totally unconvincing, and what's this handle meant to be? Then I twigged that this was actually a command version, cunningly disguised by British engineers to look from a distance like a gun tank, and the hull gun mantlet is actually a door for getting in and out.
The British were using the Grant and the Americans were using the Lee in North Africa. And those names were come up with, were developed, invented, coined by the British, naming the American tanks after generals of the American Civil War. But actually, the British did use Lees. This is a less known fact. When the Lee had been deemed obsolete against the Germans, it was considered still perfectly fine for taking on the Japanese. The Japanese had not developed any large or particularly good tanks. And so a load of Lees were given to the British and shipped out east and were used against the Japanese, but with the silly little machine gun turret at the top removed. And this particular Lee ended up in Australia, as you might imagine, out in the Far East, and now it's come all the way back here to Armageddon.
Lindy